Have you ever wondered why things are named the way they are? Like trees, plants, or even a cow. Or sometimes when we look around, a flower. Why a flower is called a flower. Or sometimes when we look on a sea, why sea is called a sea? Why couldn't be sun or a tree? Maybe sometimes we are asking, how and why? Look around you. Do you think names come naturally, or did someone name them and later this name was passed through generation to come and voila? That's why a sea is called a sea and not a tree. In that sense, if that name is not natural, meaning it was just being generated, and by whom? Of course, science tells us that only human has the ability to communicate effectively. That's the only creature who can do such thing. In this regard, we humans are the ones responsible for labeling the world and the things around us, and we use language as medium to turn the concept into object. Without further ado, that will be our topic for today. Hi there, let's begin. Structuralism began its movement in 1950s in France. Among many pioneers in structuralism, the major proponents that largely contributed to this movement were CLAUDE LEVI-STRAUSS with his Structural Study of Myth and ROLAND BARTHES. However, the origin of structuralism is rooted to the work of Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure in the early 20th century and regarded as father of structuralism, commonly in linguistics. This theory was developed in opposed to essentialist perception of reality to a representational and structural dependent one. In addition, this theory emerged from theories of language and linguistics, where it looks at the underlying elements and structures in culture and literature that can be used as a channel to further interpret the surface meaning of the text or idea. Structuralists believe that there is more than just the surface, that to fully understand something, one must look at its deeper structure and see the common system of patterns involved. For structuralism, in order to understand a concept or idea, one must look on the bigger structure that underlies it and see how it relates to the other things that is found in the same structure. For instance, in order to understand a single leaf, you must also study the tree, where that specific leaf came from. It only denotes that we cannot understand a concept if we just look on the surface area of the word or concept, but one must examine the bigger underlying structures of it. Imagine the relationship of the egg and chicken. One cannot fully understand the concept of the egg without also studying the chicken, which is the bigger structure. In order to fully understand why waves occur in the first place, one should study the physical oceanography, which in turn is just because of the wind, gravity, and earthquake that commonly cause different waves. Or we can fully comprehend the sun without studying the solar system. For just sun is part of the bigger structure, which is the solar system, the galaxies, and the universe, as simple as it is. Since language is the basis of structuralism, in addition to the utmost tenet mentioned earlier, that structuralism composed of underlying structures and patterns, further studying language can guide us towards analyzing and understanding literary pieces. According to Saussure, language is just a complex system of signs. All words we say, all human activities, even our perception and thoughts are constructed, and it is not natural. Because structuralists believe that there is no such thing as innate or natural. it is all a product of human mind, and that through language, we give and provide meaning to the object around us. These meanings were specified through signs. Sign is the smallest unit of meaning and is composed of a signifier and a signified. Signifier is the word itself or the sound we utter, while signified is the mental concept we produced out of the word or sounds we hear. For instance, when we hear or see the word tree, we then visualize something with leaves, branches, and so on. The same with the word cat. We conceptualize something with 4 legs, and so on. However, there is no inherent or innate reason and connection between a word and its meaning. That is why language, according to Saussure, is arbitrary. Arbitrary meaning there is no definite reason why a man is called a man, or why egg is called egg, and not tree, blue, or sun, or any words but just egg. That is because we define such word like egg in relation to others, meaning we understand that it is called egg because we also rely on other objects' characteristics, that we already conceptualize that an egg is something round and not triangle, or rectangle, or square. Another great example for the arbitrariness of language is that every country has their own languages, and that we call dagat in Filipino as sea in English or mer in French. If there is a common reason for the occurrence of language or words, then all countries will have the same language. Then it is not arbitrary at all. With that, language is not a reflection or a product of the world, but instead, language stands apart from the world. Language is a system that labels the world. For simple understanding, imagine you are doing the things that you are doing right now, whatever it is. Now, imagine that you are just doing it with no idea at all what the thing is called. Just actions without labels, what you should call it. That comes the language. The language helps the world to label things, to label everything, even the perception and the thoughts we have. That is why the world and the language stands apart from each other. They are like 2 different agents that were separated but have a common goal of making the world a better world. And also, that is why a language is a system that helps people to understand things commonly in the same context, and a perfect reason why it is arbitrary, because there is no inherent or innate connection between the word and the concept, or between the signifier and the signified. Going back to idea of the egg being compared to others in order to fully understand it, it means that a concept or language cannot be understood in isolation. Thus, it is relational. For instance, imagine you are standing alone in a vast blank space. Structuralism believes that you cannot understand yourself without the existence of other things because you have nothing to compare to. But imagine that you are now standing together with the monkey, chicken, and other things and animals. You can easily spot right on what makes you different from them. The language then, through human minds, will conceptualize the idea and produce names in order to label that object. Though, as it was being said, it is arbitrary and that there's no such reason why things named the way they are. Meanings can also relate to others through binary opposition and paradigmatic chain. Binary opposition is a system of pair which concepts are opposite in meaning. For example, good and evil, night and day, and the likes. Structuralism believes that if we take away one of them, the other would also not exist. It's like when we take away the idea of the day, there wouldn't be night. The presence of another is also the birth of opposing concept, so they are connected and cannot be separated. So how can we passively know the concept of happiness without the existence of sadness, right? Paradigmatic chain, on the other hand, is a particular way of perceiving and organizing our thoughts in relationship to complex objects or situation being compared. For instance, the paradigmatic chain of a hut, house, mansion, and palace. In paradigmatic chain, we can easily spot the idea being referred to an object with the help of others in the same system. We can then infer that a hut is smaller than a house, mansion being larger than a hut, and a house, but smaller than a palace, and so on. Another general characteristic or tenet of language that can be used in literary criticism is that it is constitutive. It means that language constitutes or sets the world we live in, or in simpler terms, it directs our view and understanding of the world. Take the idea of freedom fighters and terrorists, for example. If we look on their actions, in reality, somehow their actions are the same. It's just that the way the names are being constructed, the people in the world. Terrorists are someone who are more ruthless than just those people who are being freedom fighters. But when we look on what they are doing, it's just somehow the same. Let's take the Alaskan colors compared to the 7 colors of the rainbow as example. Alaskan has only 5 colors, but it doesn't mean that they can see what we can see upon looking on a rainbow. It's just that they are being limited by the vocabularies of the language that they have, though they can still see, but perceive it differently. That is why culture is also a big factor in structuralism. Different cultures have their own codes and conventions. Take beauty for instance. Different cultures have different perception of what is beautiful. There are still some ethnic groups out there who perform different bath ritual. For instance, the lotus feet of Chinese way back history. Culture is a part of structuralism in a way that a single text or concept may represent the system of codes and conventions of the culture, just like how Alaskan perceived colors. The point is, the surface or the structure is still the same, but people just have their own way of calling it. Alaskan having 5 colors doesn't lessen the value of the colors. They can still see it the way we are seeing it. It's just that the language constitutes or creates the perception of them, or in other sense, that's how their language labels their world. Remember the signifier and the signified? It is understood then that a single word may be signified differently because one group may conceptualize something differently compared to others. Just like how Alaskan people perceive colors, because as we say, language constitutes the world. That is why one way in viewing literary text is by looking on its larger system or by looking on its genre. For instance, a plot of tragedy is different to the plot of romance or horror. With this concept, language has what we call langue and parole, wherein the langue is the larger structure or the system of the language or the language itself, while the parole is the individual expressions of the language or the words we utter. Let's put it in a context of a house. The house represents the langue, while the door and the things that we'll find inside the door is the parole. Imagine there are 2 doors in a house. If you enter the first one, inside, a Korean is there. While on the other door, a French is in there. Upon entering a door, you may or may not understand what that person will say without understanding the bigger structure or its rules and systems of language, which is Korean language or the French one. In simple terms, one cannot understand that hada is the C for Korean and mer for French without even studying the overall structure of their language. In general, we have three major tenets in structuralism. First, that language has structure, or in literary criticism, it views as the underlying system found within the text. Under this tenet, there is the sign, where it composed of signifier and signified. Secondly, the language is relational, that a concept cannot be analyzed without being compared to others. In literary structuralism tends to compare one piece to others in order to look on varying systems or structure that underlies them. Under this tenet is a concept of binary opposition and a paradigmatic chain. Third, language as constitutive, that language constitutes or creates the world we live in. Under this idea are the codes and conventions that can be found in the culture, together with the langue and parole. Or in literary texts, by looking on its genre, one can easily understand why the occurrence of such events takes place. And above all this, there is an idea of language being arbitrary, that the occurrences of these things have no innate or inherent relationship with each other. For better understanding, let's have some examples on how we can apply structuralism in analyzing literary pieces. Let's take sonnet for example. In order to understand it, a structuralist may look on its pattern of having a rhyme scheme of AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and Chi. Each letter represents each line of the poem, and it means that the same letters were rhymed. You see, structuralism rather look on the structure and systems rather than on the overall concept or meaning a piece wanted to convey. That is why structuralism is somehow referred to be a method rather than a thought or theory. Let's take this short story as example again, from which a boy left home after quarreling with his father, sets out a walk through the forest and falls down in a deep pit. The father looked for his son, even managed to look into the pit but fails to see in the deep because of the darkness. At the very moment, the sun has risen to a point directly overhead, illuminates the pit's depth with its rays, and allows the father to rescue his child. After a joyous reunion, they return together. Looking on the view of structuralism, the story can be analyzed or schematized through diagrammatic form. Father being the higher significant character and the son being the low. When the son leaves his father and went to the forest, this is the first act of division of the horizontal axis, and their reconciliation is the last stage of the axis. Additionally, the representation of son being the high and the pit being the low signify the father and the son. You see, the story has its structure, but the challenge is how you are able to spot these structures or the systems. That is why structuralism is an intelligent movement and a method rather than just being a group of thoughts and a theory. One should have background for the different principles before one can analyze a piece using structuralism. The main point is that the tenets mentioned earlier are just the guides for your journey in structuralism. Another example. In order to understand the concept of a building or how a certain building was made, one must not look on the outside feature of it or its aesthetic view, but to look on what are the principles being applied in creating it or its blueprint. Another example, in fairy tales, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Cinderella, and the likes. We grew on the idea that this princess will always be rescued by a prince. So this is also a kind of pattern structuralist will also consider by looking on its genre, just like the idea of the langue and parole. The fairy tale's plot is somehow conceives a pattern. Another great example is found in Claude Levi-Strauss' The Structural Study of Myth, published in 1955, wherein he studied the structural model of myth from different cultures. According to him, a myth is somehow like a language with its lang and parole, being myth the lang and mythemes the parole. Strauss' concern is not just a single myth, but rather the underlying structure which exists in groups of myths and even all myths. According to him, all myths seem to have a common structure, which is commonly being driven by different mythemes, yet same structure. For instance, in Greek mythology, there is what they call Zeus, or the king of heaven, and Hades, being its underworld king. Same concept in Egyptian mythology, where there is also a king of heaven named Ra and Osiris for underworld. You see, there are patterns in the myth, and that's what Strauss wanted to emphasize, that all myths seem to have a common patterns. If we also look on the Indian mythology or Chinese mythology, there are these entities. At the same time, the binary opposition of these myths are also seen to be structured like there is always a presence of good and evil, heaven and earth, hatred and love, and so on. Just like what we have in the Philippines, we have Bathala and Sitan in our mythology. So I think that's the basic concepts that we should understand in structuralism. All in all, structuralism is really a challenging one, but it could become an easier task if you just focus on the idea that a word or concept underlies its meaning. The surface is not what important, because true meaning lies in its underlying structures. Let me ask you one more time. How will you explain the phenomena of a boiling water in the kettle? Well, looking on the view of structuralism, the water is boiling because the heat energy is transferred to the molecules of water, and then they form a gaseous molecules of water vapor, which float to the surface as bubbles and travel into thin air. That's how it's boiling. Another case and perspective, there is a boiling water there because someone wishes to have a coffee, and since there is no hot water available, the person decided to boil the water. I think that's all about structuralism.